From our nation's capital, Washington, D.C., it's Kickfannie's Big Thinking with Akia Garnett, CEO for Brand Builder and creator of Tuesday Branding. Welcome to today's show. So, Akia, what's new?
Hey, it's Akia Garnett, your host for Kickfannie's Big Thinking, and I'll tell you what's new. Looks like folks are all in an uproar because Barnes & Noble is selling beer kits and popcorn makers, among many other things. Appears as if they're trying to head off reverse declines in store traffic, and we all know that this is a great way for them to pad and keep those sales going during slow seasons. Is this what they should be doing? All will tell when we see those reports that are going to be coming out, regarding consumer confidence. So let's just keep our eyes open, and we like Barnes & Nobles for all the great things that they sell, including books. But if beer kits will get them through, I'll say cheers. Now, today on this show and this week, I'm excited because I'm going to be having a conversation with Kim Gandy, and she's done some amazing things in her career. You've seen her on every network when it comes to issues that have to do with domestic violence and also some other issues and priorities that she's covered throughout her very long and very impressive career in law and also in advocacy. She's just got an amazing track record. Right now, she's the president and CEO for the National Network to End Domestic Violence. She's really been working closely with folks in the NFL, especially regarding some of the things that are taking place with Ray Rice and other high-profile cases that tend to keep our attention focused on everything but football. And it's because these things are very important for us to talk about. And it's very important for us to have positive, healthy discussions about what's taking place, not only on television, not only in our businesses at the front line, but also behind the scenes, when the cameras and the lights are off, when the stores are closed, when employees go back home, what's taking place. Kim Gandy and I are going to be talking about domestic violence in the workplace and what is being done and also what still needs to take place in order for us to really begin tackling this issue where it'll kick it in the teeth is what I like to think about it when it comes to domestic violence. Kim Gandy, welcome to Big Thinking. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks, Akia. Delightful to be on your show.
Absolutely. Do us a favor, Kim, and tell us very high level what you've been focused on lately regarding the domestic violence issues, specifically with the NFL.
With the NFL in particular, I've been advising the leadership at the NFL with regard to their policies and their procedures with regard to handling internal domestic violence, both in terms of penalties, but also their own workplace policies affecting their own employees at the NFL and at the various teams.
Wow. So how has this all, in your experience, in your advice to your clients, and also in other ways that you've been speaking on the issues, how have you seen this impact the actual league?
Well, there was a tremendous impact on the league after the release of the Ray Rice video, right? Mm-hmm. Young women were mailing back those pink jerseys that they had paid a small fortune for, and people were tearing up their tickets and not going to games and just flooding the league with outrage over the fact that this had been treated so lightly. You'll recall the 2-game suspension that was the initial penalty, and the response was swift and fierce from their fan base, and they really had no choice but to act very quickly. They had some policies in place from 2007, but they had fallen into disuse.
Kim, do you think that they're losing money?
Well, I think that it had an impact on their bottom line. They're a huge enterprise, something like $9 billion. So it's hard to say whether there was an immediate impact that they felt. I think that they responded pretty quickly in an effort to staunch the bleeding, if you will. I don't know whether it will ultimately have an impact on their bottom line. I think it will depend on whether their female fans, which is their largest growing fan base, and close to 50% of their fan base is female now, which surprises a lot of people. Mm-hmm. It will depend on whether their female fan base in particular thinks and believes that they're taking this seriously.
Yeah, and I ask you that question, which might seem a little pie in the sky. Are they losing money? I ask you that question because there are many folks out there who think that the NFL is not going to do anything, that they're just buying time and waiting for this to blow over until they can go to have the Super Bowl to talk about, and then the season is over. They've got time to retool. The next season starts, and this is kind of history. Do you?
Well, time will tell. Mm-hmm. I'm not into reading tea leaves. I'm too busy dealing with reality. But time will tell whether the work that they're starting now, which seems to me to be very genuine and coming from a good place, time will tell whether it bears out, whether they stick with it and treat this as a long-term project, which, frankly, it needs to be. There's not an instant fix.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that, because when it comes to the NFL and this high-profile, of course, case and the cases that take place regarding any performance, athletes or any professional athletes, if you will, you're going to get this visibility. But companies everywhere and every day are dealing with domestic violence issues within their workforce. And
they're dealing with them, or they're not dealing with them.
Or they're not dealing with them. It's happening.
Companies everywhere have domestic violence issues in their workplace. Not all of them are dealing with those issues, and I think it's to their detriment.
Yes, so it's happening. Whether or not they are dealing with them is another thing. And so you have some interesting insight on a case study that came out from, was it L'Oreal?
Liz Claiborne.
Liz Claiborne, mm-hmm.
Liz Claiborne and Safe Horizons, and several years ago they did a study, relatively recently, of corporate staff and executives. So they surveyed the employees, the workers, but they also surveyed the executives at these corporations and had some really interesting findings. They found that of the female employees that were surveyed, 26% of them, so 1 in 4, had identified themselves as a victim or a survivor of domestic violence. That's exactly consistent with the 1 in 4 number that has come from the Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Statistics, year after year after year, very consistent, 1 in 4 nationwide. So 1 in 4 employees identified as a victim or survivor. 1 in 4 employees, 22%, almost 1 in 4, said that they had worked with a coworker who was a victim. Yet, when the employees were asked to guess how many employees of the company were victims of domestic violence, they only guessed 18%, right? So they guessed, even though many of them knew a coworker or were victims themselves, they underestimated how many other people at the company were affected. So their guess was 18% of the total employees at the company. Here's the surprising thing. The company executives estimated 6% of their employees.
Oh, they're totally oblivious, huh?
Completely out of step, even with the understanding of the workers themselves. And domestic violence really is kept pretty much under wraps. Mm-hmm. So it's not surprising that the employees underestimated from 26% to 18%, but 6%?
Yeah.
That's pretty out there.
Yeah, they're not talking about that on the golf course, you know.
No, clearly not. And so it as a result, it's not a big surprise that a lot of companies simply have not addressed this issue, even though it clearly has an impact on their workplace in reduced work performance and absenteeism and in increased expenses for health care and the like. And, you know, in part, I think some of these executives, because they think it only affects 6% of their employees, may say, oh, well, this person's been a victim and she's not performing well, so we'll just fire her. And indeed, there are companies that do that. But it's because they don't understand that she's very likely to be replaced by somebody else who's a victim. Because when you're dealing with something that's 1 in 4, you have to address it. It is going to affect your workforce. It's going to affect your bottom line as a company if you don't address it.
Well, and, you know, I just, for all intents and purposes, can I just have you give a basic definition of it? Because I think that in many ways, as much as people might think they know what domestic violence or domestic abuse is, they tend to think of what the outer manifestations of it are, like seeing a black eye or seeing a broken arm. There are many things that take place before it gets to that level. Can you talk about what the actual definition or the parameters of it are, if you will?
Sure. There's a definition from the Department of Justice that I think is pretty accurate. It defines domestic violence as a pattern of abusive behavior in a relationship that is used by one partner to gain or maintain power and control over another intimate partner. It can be physical, sexual, emotional, economic, psychological action or threats of action that influence another person. This includes any behaviors that intimidate, manipulate, humiliate, isolate, frighten, terrorize, coerce, threaten, blame, hurt, injure, or wound someone. It's kind of a long definition, but it's a pattern of behavior that enables one person to maintain control over another person. One of my coworkers says, well, there's domestic violence if he decides whether she can work, whether she can go to school, what she wears, who she's allowed to see, who she's allowed to be friends with, how she has to cut her hair, just for example. And that's one of the things that is really a red flag that there's domestic violence going on, is when you see someone exercising such control over another person that person is afraid to do anything without permission.
You know, that's really frightening. And I'm going to give you all some insight, our listeners, I'm going to give you some insight. It's great to be able to have my introduction conversations with my guests on the show, especially people like Kim Gandy, because I get to work through some of my questions. And in this particular instance, I had a real blind spot. And my blind spot was that when I see someone who's hurting, or when I perceive that there is pain, I really want to address it. Now, I know that that from many, many different levels in an organization, in a corporation, in any sort of structured environment is off limits. I am the person who would want to fix it, and if I can't fix it, then I know how to reach out to people who might be of support. And I thought and was thinking that is where most CEOs were coming from. But my earlier conversations with Kim helped me to understand that it's not. It really is that 6% where CEOs are that they're just oblivious to it. And so my question to you, Kim, is how are companies doing more even when leadership may not know, care, or do anything to prompt those discussions?
You know, in my experience, a lot of the impetus comes either from outside because something has happened that has put the company in the news, and they go, uh-oh, better deal with this. See NFL. And in others, it comes very much internally. It comes, for example, from the HR department or the employee assistance program that is seeing victims and realizing that they really don't have proper policies in place. They don't have procedures to deal with victims of domestic violence, and that it has an impact on their bottom line if they've got this many employees who are affected by a pattern of coercive abuse that has to affect their work performance. I mean, even if they cover it up really well and they're really high-performing employees, chances are good they would have been even more high-performing but for the abuse, which the employer doesn't even know, right? The employer says, oh, she's doing great. Guess what? She could have been doing a lot greater if she weren't dealing with something at home that is having an impact on the employer, whether the employer knows it or not. And it does impact the bottom line.
And if you rewind back, say, 20, 30 years ago, and a lot of people remember this because they were in workplaces where certainly these sorts of things weren't discussed. How would you say the needle has moved forward, even though there's a long way to go, Kim, I understand, but how would you say the needle has moved forward within companies and their ability to try to combat some of these issues?
Well, I think there's been a dramatic change. There are so many large employers now that not only have started enacting these policies, but some of them are working together to get other corporations to do it and sharing their information and insights. And companies like Allstate and Verizon, Avon, Mary Kay, companies that are putting in place good policies that protect their workers, that address the issues, and that protect the company's bottom lines. And those companies are reaching out to other companies, sharing information, sharing their policies. I know that one of the Allstate vice presidents was talking with one of the NFL vice presidents and offering to share their workplace policies with the NFL. So these companies, the leaders in these companies that understand the issue and know it's important are reaching out to other companies to offer help.
That's great. And so when you have, which is horrible timing, of course, to have another major story such as the Adrian Peterson story hit the headlines or continue to stay in the headlines, although this is a situation with a completely different story and the actual person involved as the victim being a child is just a different case altogether. But you've got yet another story of abuse that's taking place by an employee of the NFL, where violence is concerned. And how have you seen this also create additional room for dialogue, even though it is a different case altogether?
Well, it certainly has created dialogue around what is the appropriate way to handle the personal conduct policy, that essentially a morals clause that is in all of the players' contracts, because their behavior, their violence, their drug use, their whatever they do. I mean, there's a clause in there that says if you have a DUI or if you use drugs or whatever, your behavior reflects on the NFL, and so we have a right to impose discipline or impose other requirements like counseling, for example. So if the NFL put that into their contract, and they were using that provision in some areas, but they weren't using it really very much in cases of domestic violence or child abuse, of which there have been dozens and dozens of these cases over the last 10 years of domestic violence in which the league either didn't act or, imposed a very small suspension. And it wasn't until the Ray Rice case with the video caused such a public outcry that has changed. And of course, we all have internal conversations about what if there hadn't been a video? What if there hadn't been a camera in the elevator? And we all agreed that things would be going on just as they had before.
This is Akia Garnett. You're listening to Kick Fanny's Big Thinking. I'm interviewing Kim Gandy. She's president and CEO for National Network to End Domestic Violence. Hey, Kim, when you are working in organizations, how can you give our listeners 5 tips that you may give CEOs to help them understand how to recognize when they need to ramp up any program that they have to identify domestic violence or any other sorts of issues that may be plaguing their employees?
Well, it's important for all workplaces to have policies in place before an incident happens. And there are a lot of elements that go into these kinds of policies, but they need to make sure that there is a safe way for their employees to report something that's happening that is impacting them, that there is a way for the company to provide accommodations within reason, in the same way that you might provide accommodations to a person with a disability or somebody who broke their leg in a skiing accident and can't walk up 4 steps. So you do something to accommodate them in a temporary situation. That is frequently is helpful in the case of a domestic violence victim. So the company should have reasonable policies to accommodate that, and should have, I think, a relationship with the community organizations that affect different issues, whether it's drug use, whether it's alcoholism, whether it's anything that's affecting your employees. Your employee assistance program probably has relationships in the local community, and the local domestic violence shelter should be one of those, along with the rape crisis center and other community organizations that have the expertise and ability that you don't have and shouldn't try to have on your own staff. You can't cover everything, but you can reach out to experts in these areas, just like you reach out to experts of any other kind when your company needs assistance in an area that you don't have your own expertise in.
Great. And so, Kim, you've also done some work as general counsel, and this is the reason why this is so important, why general counsel is so important. It's because sometimes in leadership we just don't know the appropriate way to go about putting in programs, and the wording which can be used, the ways in which it can be rolled out, the people who should do the rolling out, the reporting process, all of the things that would keep the, if you will, the privacy of the employee at stake, and then also the dignity of that employee as they're going through a very challenging time in their own lives. What are some ways in which you've seen programs be rolled out, Kim, that are innovative, if you will, and just a bit creative and different?
Well, there's a wonderful website that is put together by the Corporate Alliance to End Partner Violence, CPEDV, which is the acronym for Corporate Alliance to End Partner Violence. And they have on their website some examples of company policies and company activities and actions that are relevant to domestic violence in particular. And they give examples of things that companies have done, but also companies that have good policies in these areas and are frequently willing to talk with other companies. And I'm guessing that the general counsels of these companies, as well as their HR departments, are willing to work with other businesses, as are organizations that have expertise in domestic violence and work with companies and small businesses on a regular basis.
Right. When can we expect to see, or are there frequently updated sets of data that's put out there to help us understand how these numbers are still impacting or continue to impact organizations?
Sure. The Department of Justice, through the Bureau of Justice Statistics, puts out information on a regular basis. There's a national survey that's done every year that is a broad, it's the National NISFIS, National Criminal Victimization Incident Survey, or something like that. I don't have the name right, but it's a national survey of crime and crime victimization. And that is because they are private interviews and not public revelation. I think that they're a little more accurate in terms of people revealing whether or not they're victims of abuse. So those numbers are put out also by the Justice Department every year.
That's awesome. And so when you have been called upon by some of the major news networks and folks like NPR and also CNN and so forth, what are some reasons that they continue to call you back? What challenges do they continue to want to see you address?
I tend to get called by the media when there's a big story. I did a lot of interviews around Ray Rice and Adrian Peterson in the NFL most recently, but also about a Supreme Court case that's coming up it's being argued on December 1st, and it's about cyber stalking and the extent to which online threats can be prosecuted as domestic violence. So there's a wide variety of issues that we address and deal with, both from the legal perspective and the human resources perspective that we are called to comment on.
Yeah, and can you just, flashing back in your past professional experience into said prosecutor, can you tell us a little bit about your time that you, I'm not going to say served, but the time that you spent as prosecutor?
Sometimes it feels like time served. I was a prosecutor in Louisiana, and it was a really interesting experience. It was decades ago, at a time when domestic violence, frankly, was not taken very seriously by society, far less seriously than it is taken now. And it was even then I knew about domestic violence. I'd actually volunteered at the local shelter in New Orleans and knew what a serious problem it was, but it was very hard to get attention. And frankly, the police didn't often bring cases to us. We would have cases where we knew that there had been multiple arrests, and the police simply would not make charges. And one of the things I did in Louisiana was to write legislation, which was introduced and passed by a new state legislator in that state, who's now U.S. Senator Mary Landrieu, but she was a state legislator at the time. And this legislation required that police responding to a domestic violence call had to file a written report. Not that they had to file charges or arrest anybody, but they had to make a written report when they responded to a domestic violence call. And it took 3 years to pass that because the sheriffs were up in arms. We had the Louisiana Sheriff's Association said, "Do you know how much paperwork that would be? Do you know what that would mean if we had to make a written report every time we went out on a domestic violence call?" And I said, "Yes, exactly my point." Right? Their reason for why they shouldn't have to make a report was because there were so many calls. So I think back on things like that, and I realize that we really have come far, but not far enough.
Oh yeah, I mean, right now the sound of so many calls and being able to document so many calls to be able to form a business case is very appealing and attractive today. But back then,
back then it just sounded like extra work.
It sounded like a lot of extra work and no analytics.
Exactly.
Oh wow! And so you fast forward from there in your career. Did you ever think that you'd be here and that the challenges that you're addressing now on a national front would be so grand and sensational?
The sensational part is a surprise, but it's very rewarding to think that after all these years, we finally are getting to the point that we are truly having a national conversation about domestic violence. And, you know, it had to take an elevator video to prompt it, but prompted it did. And we are having this conversation, and people are talking, and in particular, women are revealing to the surprise of their friends and colleagues that they've been victims of domestic violence. And it's starting to change people's ideas about who are victims of domestic violence.
Well, you know, and Kim, it's interesting also because I wonder, especially when you were dealing with some of the issues down in Louisiana, if it still also got to that whole vein of this is someone's private life. I really don't want to throw the book at him, if you will. Because this is, you know, let this man deal with his family. That's kind of been the way that I've heard it even in my life in the past as I was growing up, and we'd see people in our neighborhoods, maybe a husband, wife, or girlfriend and boyfriend get into a fight, and you'd see people say, mind your business, don't bother it, just, you know, let that man deal with his family. And you kind of had that same kind of mentality go into the workplace, of course, because it is people, after all, working there, and they're all coming from some background which is pretty much help them understand how to deal with various issues in life. And so how do you deal with that whole concept of people just being uncomfortable talking about it because it is a private situation to many people?
Yeah, that's something that has changed some over the years, but there still is that sense that this is a private matter between two people. And my response to that is it's a crime.
Yeah, it's a crime. It's not
a crime, like any other crime. And we all have a responsibility, if we know that a crime is being committed, to think about what we can do, even if it's nothing more than to dial 911 when something is happening that's clearly a crime being committed.
And naturally, because Kim has served as a prosecutor, I can, not assuming that you have any insight on this particular situation that's taking place, but I can even bring up this whole Ferguson thing with you, because I would imagine that you've got some thoughts on what's taking place there. Yet again, another big story, violence, and in this instance, the police force happens to be what many would perceive to be the predators versus the saviors. And so what have been your thoughts, and what are you thinking might even be a potential outcome once this verdict comes down?
You know, I think that there are far too many communities that see the police that way. One would hope that there wouldn't be any communities that would see the police that way, but that would require a change in behavior on the part of the police to make that true. But it's a sad commentary on society that there are people who don't, and frankly, that's an issue in domestic violence in the African American community in particular, where African American women have experienced more domestic violence. They're at increased risk for domestic violence, but at the same time are torn between wanting to call the police in the hopes that they would do something, and fear of calling the police for fear that they would do something.
This is just it's a mess, and I am just curious to see how the nation will respond. I mentioned a few months ago when the story originally broke that the outcome of it, Ferguson in particular, would really change the landscape in many ways, and it would challenge America to finally begin addressing police brutality and so many other things that are associated with protection being served or not being served in very impoverished or underserved areas.
Sure.
And I thank you for weighing in on that, and I thank you for spending time with us today on Kickfanny's Big Thinking. If people are interested in communicating with you or having you come in or getting you to speak at an upcoming event or so forth, how can they reach you?
We have a website, which is NNEDV.org. That's the acronym for National Network End Domestic Violence, NNEDV.org. And there's a contact us form on there. And so you can, probably the communications team is the best way to reach me. They can get in touch with me at all times.
Great. And so any parting words for CEOs who may be listening in and saying, you've got my attention, I think we've got some things in place, I'm thinking we can do more, what can they do?
They can reach out for advice. They can reach out through their general counsel, through their HR, reach out to some experts who can take a look at their policies and tell them what else they can do. Because there are very few companies. There are companies that have what I would consider model policies, but they're few and far between. Most everybody can improve, and it's going to help your bottom line if you do.
All right. Thank you so much. Kim Gandy.
Really a pleasure.
Wonderful time spent with you today. I appreciate your chiming in on so many things that are taking place in the business environment, but also in our own communities around the country. And you've been listening to Kick Fanny's Big Thinking with Akia Garnett. My guest has been Kim Gandy. She's giving you her website. Reach out. Find out more ways that you can put in place the services that will help your employees live better lives, of course, so that at the end of the day, you can do what's important to your shareholders, which is show them the return. Take care, and remember to think big.
You've been listening to Kick Fanny's Big Thinking with Akia Garnett, a Kick Fanny production. Akia Garnett is a Kickfannie.com contributor, and she's CEO for Brand Builder and a national columnist for Minority Business Entrepreneur magazine, a leading source in supplier diversity and inclusion. Be sure to join Akia for Tuesday Branding on social media when she brings news from across all platforms for small business owners and entrepreneurs all day, starting with the Akia Garnett Show, 10 a.m. Eastern, and Kick Fanny's Big Thinking with Akia Garnett at 6 p.m. Eastern, ending with My Brand Chat on Tuesday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern. See the full Tuesday lineup at Kickfannie.com and KiaGarnett.com. And we'll see you next week on Kick Fanny's Big Thinking.